very pleased for us to kick off this panel with 4 fantastic speakers representing 4 different perspectives. We have Ansgar Koene, who is the Global AI Ethics and Regulatory Leader at Ernst & Young, where he leads the AI-related public policy team. Welcome, Ansgar. We have Aurelie Jacquet, who is the chair of Standards Australia and an independent consultant who advises several companies on responsible implementation of AI. So, Aurelie, we're so excited you can bring that sort of your deep expertise on technical standards. We have Jaisha Wray, who is a senior executive, a member of the Senior Executive Service and an associate administrator for international affairs at the US's Department of Commerce. The US Department of Commerce's National Telecommunications and Information Administration. There's a usually abbreviated, or the acronym is NTIA, which you would have heard about in the US. And then last but not least, we have Roy Sugimura, who is the Chief Collaboration Officer of Japan's AIST, where he leads a team of experts from industry, academia, and government to collaborate on standardization for AI. So I think in the last panel, we heard so much on benchmarks, interoperability. I think we had an excellent Q&A question yesterday, actually, on whether interoperability is an important principle to focus on, or whether it's actually just, I think, creating noise. I think it's an important one, but of course I come from a standards background, so I'm biased. But I think in the last panel, what we heard, and particularly from Singapore, is that there's a lot of work that different jurisdictions are doing at the international level, but even when they're sort of thinking about designing their domestic policies, a lot of it is done in mind of how will this be interoperable, align with other countries and also with multilateral bodies, such as, for example, the work that is being done at the OECD. And I think what we're also seeing is that policymakers are looking into their toolbox. So we recently announced a policy steering committee, and in that announcement, something we spoke about is the trade-offs, though, that governments are sort of navigating. What should be the combination of how much emphasis I should put on domestic versus international? What role do existing trade agreements or international organizations play? Something that we're increasingly been talking about at PAI, for example, is IP. And to what extent do existing trade agreements govern IP? What role should the WTO play? But again, what should domestic countries do to resolve ongoing IP questions? So no pressure to you guys on the panel. We're going to turn to governing AI globally to help us think through some of these questions. And we'll start actually with a quick fire. So we love putting you guys a bit under pressure when it comes to answering these questions. And if you had to pick just 1 or 2 principles to guide the decision on whether policy should be developed at the domestic or the international level, what would that be? I will pass to Ansgar first.
Sure. So I think one aspect is just a very practical one. To what extent is the issue that you're developing policy about going to effectively be something that primarily impacts organizations that are operating globally? So if you're dealing with globally operating organizations, they will be needing to work in multiple jurisdictions. So getting coordination on those kinds of policies will be an important one in order to make sure that these organizations will want to continue to work in your jurisdiction and engage with that. The other element, and I think we'll hear that echoed, is when it comes to technical implementation kind of side, things like the technical standards that come in to being the way in which you show compliance. Those things you really want to be getting as much as possible usage of international kinds of standards.
Awesome, thanks, Ansgar. Jaisha, why don't we come to you next?
Great. No, I would just say we need to ensure consistency and transparency. And it's hard to say whether it should be domestic or international, because I would say both. We really mean both, and our international policy informs our domestic policy and vice versa. And that's why in the US, we've been so pleased to see consistency between the White House voluntary commitments and the G7 Hiroshima process and the guiding principles. And that's not an accident, because when we developed the White House voluntary commitments, we consulted our like-minded partners. And you heard this morning about the need for international harmonization from Lord Clements and across the board. And that is just key. Dialogue is key to ensure a consistent, harmonized approach.
Aurelie?
From my perspective, I think the first important message is learn from data policy. We've been there, we've done that. It's getting amplified with AI. I was an expert as part of the outreach initiatives that the EU Commission launched on the EU AI Act and its initiative on trustworthy AI. And what we see is a shift from how the GDPR was developed to the EU AI Act. So that's the first one. The second, I'll quote Michael, I was on the panel before, agile governance. We've heard it yesterday and again today. AI is evolving. Not everyone's got every piece of the solution. So the international dialogue really support the national priorities and really help evolving and making good policy.
Right.
Okay. In my perspective, I have some maybe the experience to work in international standardization body. First thing we need to care is that maybe the relation with the existing regime or regulations, because nothing can be done without any base. So the relation is existing something, and with respect is very important. And the second thing we need to think is impact, because new ideas always try to replace something new or modify, or maybe no need to care about. That means an open discussion and shared knowledge about such kind of relation and impact will be the very crucial role for us to go forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Roy. So I think a few really important points there. And Aurelie, maybe we'll come back to you first. If we just take the UK, for example, the UK has the British Standards Institution, but then the UK also collaborates at the ISO level, the CEN-CENELEC, but the idea, of course, being that hopefully, as much as possible, internationally sort of trickles down, but there are some instances where a specific jurisdiction might have to have its own standards. You, of course, represent Australia in a lot of AI standards forums internationally. What are the specific factors from a sort of like technical perspective are you sort of taking into consideration as you decide for Australia what should be done at the international level or what should be done domestically? The last point I'll very quickly pick up on, I think you made a really important point, Jaisha, about the voluntary commitments and the sort of goal to sort of push that internationally. I think the last panel, we mentioned starting points. I think the US is, of course, a country that is well positioned and able to sort of have that sort of international push of domestic policies. But we do know that that is also not the case of other countries. And so that trade-off and the factors you use might vary. So what are some of the questions or factors that Australia considers?
Thank you. So we, in Australia, we've actually, all the ISO standards, we have adopted them so far. We've not made any specific standards for Australia. The reason for that is, as you mentioned, Jaisha, we actually think there's a strong interrelation between international and national. I think, again, yesterday, there was a really good point that's made. How do we build ecosystem of initiatives? Standards are really key in doing that, to helping build those ecosystem of initiative. Standard Australia, I led with Standard Australia in APEC SOM, a workshop on how to scale AI responsibly, leveraging standards for the APEC countries. we'll publish that report in November or before the end of the year. And in that report, what we found upon the APEC countries that were participating in our workshop is that effectively standards informed policy helps them build more interoperable policy and helps them really understand where all the different countries are and being leveraged in the conversation and participate in that conversation. So that, now bringing back to Australia and the point we made, in Australia, we actually participate in a number of international initiatives. We signed the OECD principle, we're part of the JPI, and we're leading at the ISO standards. So to give you a couple of practical examples, from a national perspective, you need to discuss your priorities, understand how you're going to use AI, what's the risk. So that's our national conversation. But then for Australia, effectively, environmental and sustainability is one challenge that comes with AI. And that's why at ISO, Australia is leading this initiative. From a privacy perspective, we see that the ICO has worked with the OAIC on a joint investigation of facial recognition startups. So we see that cooperation and the work that we do locally feeding very nicely and building on this AI ecosystem initiative. So just building on that agile governance.
Thanks, Aurelie. Josh, we'll come back to you, actually, because many folks in the audience will probably know the NTIA had a call for comment quite recently on AI accountability and is leading a lot of work in the US around AI audits, risk safety assessments, certifications, et cetera. And we are expecting the NTIA's report based on the evidence that they received quite soon. So I'm so pleased that we have you here today, Jaisha. So as the US is sort of considering its own approach to sort of tool certification through the NTIA, how are you thinking about the international level, how the international will inform you, how will it inform your approach? Are there any challenges that you would like to point to?
Great. So those who may not have seen it, I think the whole world saw it because we got 1,400 comments. But just in case, we published an RFC, request for comments, last April. And the idea here is to determine if AI is working as claimed and without causing harm, and what can be done to ensure that. And so there were a number of questions looking at the data necessary for AI assessments, the role of the regulators, whether sector-specific resources were required. And we did, in fact, read through all 1,400 comments. We did not rely on AI, as many have asked. And the report is coming soon, hopefully by the end of this year. And what's fascinating is, in terms of domestic versus international, it is very much both, because I will note that of those 1,400 comments, many were from international entities and stakeholders. And we believe that the results of this report, which will be policy recommendations, will inform the entire AI ecosystem, both domestic and international. So hopefully no challenges and lots of synergies.
Thanks, Jaisha. So Roy, it's fantastic to have you here and sort of thinking about this from a Japan perspective. You, of course, have the Japan G7 presidency. And I know we mentioned earlier the work that the G7 is leading on the International Code of Conduct and also new principles. So how is Japan deciding about what to deliver domestically at the moment? Again, I know in the last panel we spoke about the fact that every jurisdiction needs to bear in mind its region, its context, to design potentially tools as well. And then what are you also thinking about specifically driving through the G7 as an example of an international forum?
First of all, I need to say I'm not entitled to speak on behalf of Japanese government. So maybe that this is a very personal view, sorry. However, yeah, exactly, I, in some extent, an expert in the standardization, I rarely get involved at the talk. And so in my understanding, For example, Japan has a very long history to maybe investigate what should we have in the age of AI. And that began in my memory, my memory is a little bit fragile, however, 2016, when we have G7 summit, Japan have already issued the government titled document in public. So we have from that, maybe the 7 years plus, and so during that, maybe the role of Japanese government increasing, for example, currently, not just for the leader of G7, however, out of the GPI, also Japan is responsible to lead that position, and also we have several types of chance to lead. But we have not self-interest. That means we wish to contribute as much as possible. For example, considering about the G7 principle, 10th principle, you can see, not the policy. That writing is exactly in between policy high level and engineering level, if you can have some chance to observe. That means granularity of such kind of principle is very important for everyone to understand. If that one is a very high level, it's okay. Of course, that will reflect as a value of our society. For example, human rights, very important. However, if we wish to implement that policy into the in principle or maybe real one, we need to have several type of in-between statement. In my understanding, for example, in G7, maybe a statement. Now, many distinguished my colleagues must have the chance to speak up at that, but that will be corrected, edited in this year, and hopefully that will contribute for everyone to deploy that into the real world. This is in my understanding. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So Ansgar, we'll come to you last on this question before we move on to the building blocks of interoperability. Of course, you're at EY and you work with many different types of organizations internationally. Of course, you're sitting besides governments and standards representatives. What would be your thought on how countries should be thinking about what to deliver domestically versus international? And as we've heard, what fits in between to just kind of draw the synergies between the two?
Sure. So yes, indeed, we get questions from quite a number of firms that we engage with on how can they get ready for these new regulations that they see coming down, these new kinds of commitments or guidelines that are coming out. What is the best way to get ready for this plethora of activities that are happening? So one of the things that we did is to do a review paper of sort of what are the common themes that we are seeing. And I think everybody here recognizes, of course, it's very beneficial that we see basically global agreement on the core principles that underlie the direction of these regulations and commitments, etc. Of course, different countries have a different legislative history, a different sort of convention in which they approach these kinds of questions. And we can't expect all countries to suddenly align on how they're going to approach this, but that's not really what we need. What we need is that when it comes to the question sort of on the ground, what you actually need to do as a company to get ready to be compliant with either be it a regulation or be it with guidelines, that you effectively can do more or less the same kind of activities. And that's where it's important that the various approaches across countries refer back to the same kinds of international standards as the preferred way to do to get your compliance with these.
Awesome. And I think you've left us with a sort of perfect point to move on to the next question around interoperability, because I think a critical aspect of interoperability at the international level, right, is having consensus on core building blocks. And so from my old life, leading standards in the UK, we spend a lot of time thinking about definitions, taxonomies, what we would call foundational standards, right? The metrology, a lot of the work that NIST does, and establishing a common understanding, right, through which you can deliver technical standards. What I think, though, we've heard throughout this forum is that I think yesterday we came back to that loop, that definitions are changing, taxonomies are consistently changing. And so what we would have had as traditional and maybe more easy building blocks for other technologies is not what we potentially have at the moment. So in this fast moving pace, and again, we've talked about the frontier, the fact the frontier is always moving, what can be done at a technical level and what are the challenges that we should expect? So Aurelie, we'll start with you here. What are the foundational building blocks that you think we need to have in order to facilitate a strong international assurance ecosystem when it comes to foundation models? And are there any roadblocks to getting there?
So when it comes to international standards, international certification, it's always the same challenge, not different from AI, from many others, is effectively we are promoting, standards are here to promote diversity of voice, diversity of perspective. As Ansgar saying, I'm a lawyer from background, having one regulation that's applied perfectly across different countries. So what standards are doing particularly well is if you look, I come here, when I plug my computer, whether I'm in France or in Germany or in Australia, you have like the variation of plugs that you can use for each country. Standards, in a way, that's what they do. They literally use different aspects to have interoperability and allow diversity of regulation. But we see lots of crosswork to actually build those bridges between them. So to have good international standards certification, first we need to make sure we promote diversity and bridges across those diversity of perspective. That's one. Then obviously you need, one, good standards. So what I love about standards, why I got involved, it's not reinventing the wheel. I had lots of conversation here with a few people where we see, oh, AI is new, we need to reinvent process. With standards, when you build consensus, you cannot reinvent process. Some try, but effectively you have to build on existing process. One of the challenges, though, is we see from time to time vertical process trying to be brought at the horizontal level. So that's one of the challenges we're facing when we build good standards. And conflicts between, so at the moment the standards are still developing, so there's not many conflicts, but pinpointing very early on conflict between standards and international initiatives, that's also one of the challenges. When it comes to certification, we have lots of work at the moment developing on conformity assessment scheme. So you see that feeds in the trade, the work that's happening at the WTO about discussing products, services. At the moment, we have 42001, which provides certification of AI, of organization that use AI systems. So it is at the organizational level. But now what does that mean for product and services? So that's a broader conversation that's happening right now. And the last challenge, I'll finish on that, when it comes to certification, and I know a few countries still thinking about that, is recertification. When you issue certification in the market, the AI is a dynamic system, so how do you make sure you can reissue that certification fast? Because some of the system are critical in the way they use. Thank you.
Aurelie, and we'll come back to this point on speed, actually, because we'll come back to a question for Jaisha on this reissuing and how we do that, actually. But Ansgar, we'll come to you first because you're very heavily involved at the European level at CEN-CENELEC. So CEN-CENELEC, for folks who don't know, is the European standards body. They're creating the technical standards that will support the implementation of the EU's AI Act. What building blocks do you see as sort of necessary to align what might come from Europe with the standards that might be delivered elsewhere? No pressure, I see everyone sort of smiling. I think a backdrop which I can say around this, right, is and we just had the National Policymakers panel, is around the Brussels effect. Do we just expect that Europe will go first, we'll have the Sensenelec standards, and therefore, rather than the international moving down to the regional and then down to the national, we'll instead see the European regional moving up to the international? But of course, the NTIA is doing work. That might not be the same as the Sensenelec. So how is Europe really thinking about making that interoperability possible?
Sure, yeah. I think that's a really good question about how does the relationship between where the standards are being created and and where the regulations are being created actually play into this. And interestingly, what we actually see is in the dynamics, because the regulation is going to require these standards to be in place very fast, certainly in comparison to the normal rate at which standards are being developed. The pressure at Sensenelec is really to say, wherever possible, if there exists any kind of an already developed standard or largely already developed standard at the ISO level, or frankly also at other kinds of places, they've been looking at IEEE, for instance, as well, import those, and if necessary, make some add an annex or something like that to clarify which elements that perhaps in the original standard were positioned as optional would become mandatory if you're using the standard to show compliance with the AI Act. So very much the driver at Sensenelec is to say, wherever possible, import an ISO standard. Only if there is no ISO standard that exists, or if the ones that do exist diverge radically from what Europe would require, will there be any work to develop a new standard, simply because it's impossible to create all of those necessary standards within the time frame to be able to have companies be compliant with an AI Act within 2 years of it being signed off, if the standards themselves only come out 4 years after the regulation was signed off.
Thanks, Ansgar. So lastly on this question will come just because we have Roy in relation to the G7. The G7 AI Hiroshima process is hoping to establish guardrails for advanced AI systems at the global level, and also, I think, equally hope to facilitate some of this interoperability. But it's great, of course, the EU is engaged, and I know I mentioned earlier that the EU did issue already a sort of request for evidence and support to feed up to the G7 process, which is really great. Can you share more about the ambition of the G7 initiative and what is being done to establish these principles and ultimately what might also contribute to the code of conduct?
In that regard, anyway, first of all, what we need to do is that anyway, maybe the mutual understand what's going on. For example, I personally, maybe Ansgar knows that I'm an observer of Sensenelec JTC 21, that I can see all the detail of the document in WG level. That means it's not a privilege, but an obligation for me, because I need to send message to Japanese government what's going on in European side with respect. This is a very important point. And for example, what we can do is, for example, in Europe, there is some discussion related to small, medium enterprise, okay? And you might know that in Japan, overall context, maybe a big company exists, like Fujitsu, Sony, Hitachi. However, observing such kind of difficulty in European context, as Japan national body, we decided, for example, to propose the international level to discuss about whether we can make a good standard for not just of SME, but micro, small, medium enterprises. For them, just such several type of the standard must be very easy to use. So, of course, in the European, our respected entities have right to speak up. However, if they say, oh, okay, European guys need to this. However, if we can say, speak up, maybe that this can be handled, very neutral one. So it's such kind of mindset is very basic for us to promote such kind of collaboration. I hope this can be the answer to you.
And Roy, it's so great to know that you're an observer at Sensenlec, and that is, I think, a great part of Sensenlec, that they do invite sort of international voices to engage. So the last question then, and looking at the audience to get ready for hard questions, we'll come back to you, Jaisha, because I think we've noted a lot of work that is ongoing, that the ability to align that all, while it's all developing, is of course a challenge. And Aurelie, you specifically pointed to that point, and that important point around reissuing speed certification. And I would like to say that standards haven't been the fastest processes traditionally. So how can we speed up the process? But also, Jaisha, we'll come to you. How do we ensure that what the NTIA is developing is therefore future-proofed? How do you ensure that as policies potentially develop or other sort of proposals from other countries arise, that the NTIA proposal is able to be flexible to align with them? And then we'll come back to the other panelists on alignment and speed.
Great. No, it's a critical question, and the approach we've taken is a risk-based one, so that you can ensure that risks are mitigated as they emerge or as they fade. Another strategy that we employ is technology neutral whenever possible, because then you can ensure that you are adaptable, and the word that keeps coming up is agile. So those are two of the strategies. Do you want me to talk a little bit about the speed issue? Okay. So policies, standards, technology, they all have different speeds, right? And so we have technology moving very quickly, policies a little bit slower, and then standards often slower. And so, but we really need the policy. And so I would say we need to keep the momentum up on the policy side to do our best to keep up with the technology. And as Aurelie mentioned, the standards can influence the policy, but it goes the other way. The policy can influence the standards in terms of what is prioritized and promoted there. And so keeping up the momentum across the board is key. And I went to UCLA for university, and a famous basketball coach there, John Wooden, used to say, be quick, but don't hurry. And that's really, I think, the key here is on policy, on regulations. We need to keep moving, but not rush.
A great point. I'm not sure, how would I will come back again on Q&A. Do you guys think that we should hurry, not rush? Do you think we need to rush? Because I think that standards traditionally have been slow, but slow for maybe a reason, right? Intentionally. Certification is an important part. It's what regulators will use. You certify a product, and therefore it's deemed safe. And so it bears a lot of responsibility. But what does speeding up that process mean? In many, many regards, including for safety. But what do you guys think about the speed question? How can we ensure that all these proposals that we've discussed, as AI models rapidly evolve, that they are future-proofed and can be updated and also evolving? And then we'll come back to Q&A. Do you want to start?
Okay. I think one element is, as was already mentioned, a lot of aspects can be dealt with without linking them directly to a particular technological implementation side. So a lot of the risk management aspects, for instance, can refer to processes that you need to have in place, can refer to how to identify problems in the outputs and those kinds of questions, where it doesn't really matter that much what the underlying technology was that created that kind of output. So that way they can be more rigid, as opposed to having to change that quite that quickly. The other aspect, of course, is build on what already exists. Frankly, a lot of the challenges that are being presented as being completely novel are not completely novel. You may just have to look outside of your particular niche and look into other disciplines that have already looked at it. We found that we can learn a lot, for instance, by looking at the medical devices and how those have been regulated, as well as the standards that live in that kind of space.
I am not a big fan of the race conversation. I think we've heard that before. I have been on the receiving end of fast regulation from the algorithmic trader. When we had the GFC, we had heavy hitting regulation that was not aligned with our practices. So to have to, in that instance, to discuss with the regulator and explain our perspective, that was a challenge. We, in the AI world, I just point you to the New York law on AI. We saw what happened with fast regulation. I think we need to go fast enough, to your point. And what I like, again, about standards, they're not perfect. But one thing is actually they provide for updates. For example, right now, we have the definition in 22989 that have been published. We're now including definition on generative AI. So you have a good base that is effectively updatable. Well, that's not sure. I'm working on the English word that can be updated in a more an easier way. And standards, one thing they're really good at is getting consensus faster than other international initiatives. So from that perspective, they're a good, not a perfect mechanism, but a good mechanism to leverage to do fast enough.
Awesome, thanks, Aurelie. Last but not least, Roy.
Wow, what should I add? Yeah, I completely agree with Aurelie that maybe I coming from the standards and world, and so even though one says that it will take 5 years to revise, however, actually we have the amendment strategy that will be very quicker for everyone to share. And so maybe if you rush, maybe the longest path might be the shortest one. But if I could add one more, is that my proper involvement of actual specialists is very, very essential. Yeah, and so the country, in Japan, honestly speaking, up to the 2012, maybe the AI is not a major field for the student to learn. However, after that, we have the urgent need to grown up people. So currently, one of the most serious problems, if we wish to go rush, maybe the education is also the very, very crucial part for us to realize. If I could add, thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Roy. And with that, we'll come to Q&A.